In the mid-50s or late 50s, an organization started called Synanon, which at that time, drug addicts were considered to be incurable. Once an addict, always an addict. And on a storefront in Venice, California, people began to gather and help each other. And the people in Santa Monica really hated it because it was black, white, Latino, Native American, all living together, men and women, helping each other, supporting each other. That became known as the therapeutic community. And it was very disruptive because there were no doctors in charge of it. In fact, the guy who started it was put in jail for 30 days for running a hospital out of zone. But it wasn't a hospital. It was the beginnings of the therapeutic community, which you are all the beneficiaries of, the courage of those people who made that commitment half a century ago. Okay? But it was very, very disruptive. It drove the doctors crazy and the bureaucrats completely out of their skulls because no professional seemed to be in charge of it. And of course, that's very, very dangerous. Okay? So here we are, 50 years later, and you are part of that disruption because you're changing your lives, which is very disruptive for the people who know you and expect you to continue to fail and fuck up. And when you don't do that, it's very disruptive. When you reach across to somebody who you grew up saying, I can't like that person because of the color of their skin, or of their religion, or of their background, and you make a friend of that person, that's very disruptive. And that's the kind of disruption that we really need today in our country and really around the world. People willing to cross the line, whatever the line is, and reach out to another human being and really connect to them. And that's really what therapeutic communities are all about. They're about engagement, they're about connection, they're about disrupting the patterns of our personal lives and of our community in a positive, nonviolent, loving way. I have the great honor this morning to introduce a friend of mine who has been involved in this entire disruptive movement for 50 years or more. I'm not exactly sure of the date that George got involved with therapeutic communities back in New York. But he started off as a great jazz musician, and he's continued to be a great jazz musician. He got involved, he had friends in the music community who were addicts, and that kind of led him into this kind of work. He's done research, he's been a teacher, a mentor, he's traveled all over the world. Next Tuesday, he'll be flying to Istanbul, Turkey, to receive an award and to help one of the first therapeutic communities in the Arab world get started. He's done that all over the world. He's written several books. He's published thousands of articles about therapeutic communities. And he came here to spend a few days with us this week. We're going to do some videotaping of him, and he'll also probably give you some feedback on what he thinks about Amity as he's here this week. So my friend, George DeLeon.
Well, good morning, family. Good morning. All right, I'll take that. That's good. Rod has essentially covered a lot of the history of the TC in terms of therapeutic communities, in terms of its 50-year evolution or its beginnings, and a little bit of my involvement. By training, I mean, in addition to playing jazz, I got back to school, I got back to college when I was 26, and was able to then go on and get several degrees there. And so by training and by trade, I'm a psychologist. But of course, I'm still playing music, and that's in many ways still number one. Look, many of the right points have been made, but I'm going to try to say it the way I always say it when I come to programs and spend a little bit of time. I always ask for 10 minutes to make sure that, in addition to the staff and faculty, that the residents and students understand something. That in that period, 50 years ago, where there was no known successful treatments, either for drug addiction or related social deviancy problems, people were written off and they wrote themselves off. And that was the period, and why you need to hear this, and you've heard it in one way, and it's very important to emphasize it. We did not know then any way in which individuals who either got involved in addiction and associated kind of deviant lifestyles, we did not know how to change them, and they did not know how to change themselves. In the former language, there were no treatments, no cures. You have to think about that. Now, at least I'm old enough to say, well, I remember that period when, in effect, if you got caught up in anything of that lifestyle, there was only two outcomes. It was either going to be prison or death. Usually by 44 years old. You've got to think about that. So the miracle that occurred, and it's a miracle that has to be recreated in every single program every year. The miracle that occurred was that people came together. The Synanon example you heard as the first example of that. In New York, there was a rapid evolution of those kinds of programs. I was associated with a place called Phoenix House in New York. And what was happening was the very victims that were the individuals who were suffering became essentially the individuals who would change themselves. Society couldn't do it, medicine couldn't do it, education couldn't do it. They learned on a 24/7 basis how to change yourself. Look, I say this with a little drama. First of all, I got to keep myself interested in life. That's why I keep talking this way. But in fact, the content is very important for you to understand. How did, in fact, we discover that people could indeed change from serious, debilitating lifestyles that they were living? How could they do that? They discovered how to do it. That's what got me involved in it. As a psychologist early on, of course, I had seen, as Rod mentioned, I had seen the victims from the music business and so on. I was always skirting on the edge of making sure I didn't get caught up in that. I got lucky. I had to take care of a mother who needed me, which is a fundamental ingredient, someone who needs you. And I watched and said, wait a minute, as a psychologist, this wasn't simply symptoms going away, people feeling better. This was people who were transforming. That's what I saw. People transforming. Come in one way, 18 months, 2 years later, come out another way. Walking and talking differently. Identities changing. Who I am, an addict, a criminal, I'm not that. That's identity. I'm no longer that. So as a psychologist, I saw, and this is the ego side of myself, so you've got to buy this too if you're going to listen to me at all, and as a psychologist, I say, wait a minute, there's a great event going on here. I wanted to be part of that. That was the ego side of me. I wanted to be part of somehow making this happen and seeing if I can get a small little piece of credit for helping it move. Unfortunately, that part of my ego is still operating, so you'll have to forgive me about that. But now, why am I, and so I just said this to you in a kind of both teaching, preaching tone, but then I realized this will not work in the world. I learned then, if the mainstream establishment, medicine, science, education, if they didn't buy it. So I decided the only way I can really help them is they don't need me as a psychologist at Phoenix House. They don't need me, people essentially working with their emotions in their heads. The community will do that, and we'll come back to that. But the way they needed me and the way I decided I could be of help is we have to be able to convert this into a mainstream story so that medicine, universities, policy people would accept it and respect it. And so I devoted myself to conventional science. I said, we're just going to have to study this, and we're just going to have to write about it as essentially a conventional scientific discovery that was unfolding, even though it obviously started with other roots of passion, communalism, healing, love, everybody essentially trying to save their lives. We know how it started. How do you convert that into a mainstream science? So I've spent most of the years of my professional life in research, and more recently the last 15 or 20 years, making sure that whatever we were discovering about this really needed to be understood, really needed to be practiced in the right way so it didn't falter, so that it would last much beyond the 20th century when it began. So when I come around to programs, I'm always looking at them, believe it or not from the standpoint of the uplifting, exhilarating sense that community always gives me, and I always get it, but I always come and ask the question, are they doing it right? And the reason for that is not to be critical. The reason is to make sure that they are doing it right, because that's what's going to make it endure. First, the effects of what they're doing will work. That's a scientific seminar, and if we get a chance, I'll do 15 minutes of that at some point, about the outcomes and how it works and why it works. But if they don't do it right, it won't work. So I spend a lot of time coming to make sure we don't lose this precious discovery. And the only way I know how to protect it is to make sure that, do we understand what we're doing? Do we understand why we're doing it? And do we understand the relationship between what we're doing and how people finally change? And as long as we know that, communities can essentially thrive and live, as long as they stick to what it is we understand about how and why we change. So I'm going to spend a few days here, and Amity's always been my respite. Every 15 years, I kind of come in and collapse at the door, you know what I mean? Because I'm tired, you know, or whatever. But I'm here now in some ways with another edge to my purpose, and that is to again, look hard at Amity, because we don't have many Amitys in the world. And I want to come back to the issue of, could we help Amity move even further along in this approach and make it in many ways, the language I'm using recently, the center of excellence. But that's going to involve all of the residents, all of the students, all of the faculty, all of the board being committed to essentially trying to make this approach enduring. So we'll talk over the next couple of days, you know, as we interact, and I want to hear from you. Okay, let me just stop for now and